something that disappeared.
Hi, my name is Rich Malika. I'm one of the founders of Kingdom Recovery, and I'm here with my illustrious colleague, Miss Jenny Bob.
Hello.
And I just want to start off by giving a little bit of my story. When I was born, I was born into a family where there was mental illness. My mother had severe trauma. Multiple generations of her family had been sexually abused, and her trauma got to the place where she had a break with reality, and she was diagnosed schizophrenic and became suicidal, and was just really, really hurt and wounded. She was taken advantage of and got into some unhealthy relationships. Got pregnant, terminated a pregnancy, and just had a psychotic break and thought for a year that she was an angel because she couldn't deal with the grief and the shame that she felt from having had a partial birth abortion. She met my father, and my father was horribly traumatized, beaten badly as a child, alcoholic family, real rural culture, and just he came out here and he was smooth talking Italian, alcoholic, got beat up bad, almost killed, had his head cracked open with a lead pipe because he beat somebody, and almost died, had head trauma and an anxiety disorder. He couldn't drive past a certain radius. He'd have a panic attack. He jumped out of cars. So there was a lot of, they met, and their trauma fit. So they, got married, had me, and 6 months later, my dad was pulling my mother out of the bed in the middle of the night, just beating her when he'd come home drunk. Didn't have to have a reason. He just wanted something to beat. And my mom divorced him and said, if you stop drinking, I'll get back with you. So that was when I was 6 months old. I went to live with my grandfather, who had molested generations of my family. Molested my mother, all my aunts, and ended up molesting my cousins and myself. My cousin Billy was the oldest, and he mirrored that behavior. And that's something that of all the stuff that happened in my family, that was the most shameful thing. We could talk about the addiction, we could talk about the mental illness, we could talk about suicide and all this other stuff, but we couldn't talk about the sexual abuse. And that underpinned a lot, especially with the men in my family. There was just a lot of shame and a lot of suicidal urges that went along with that. And just, we're walking along in life, keeping this huge secret, feeling like we're different or we're flawed. And then I realized years later that most of the people I grew up with were survivors of some form of sexual abuse. But my cousin mirrored that behavior on us. And when I was 6 years old, my mother and my father got back together. He didn't drink, but he never filled the void in his soul. He became more bitter. It was like that you took the only thing that he coped with away, but he didn't replace it with anything positive or anything healing at all. So instead of physically beating my mother, he would just verbally abuse us, and he would still physically abuse his mother, my grandmother. He would bring her into a room, and they would be arguing, and you would just hear and just hear him hitting her, and she'd be yelling things back to him, and that's how he coped. So when I saw that, I thought that my dad was the life of the party when he was using. And when he wasn't using, he was miserable 24 hours a day. So I associated getting high and drinking and doing drugs as when his life was good. And all the stories he would tell, the crazy stuff and all that stuff. And I associated being sober with misery. And I mean, the marriage was never healthy, but the way my dad framed it was life was good before. I started coping. I had a couple coping skills. I ate before the drugs. I read comic books, and I wrote. And I wrote poetry and short stories. And I would pour out all this stuff that I just didn't have any place for it. And it was my way of communicating, even to myself, rationing out on a piece of paper like what life was and how my reality actually was functioning. Because I knew what I was being told wasn't true. I knew I wasn't living in a healthy family. I knew that the rules that we were living by were insane. But I didn't have any other mirror. And my dad kept me from friends. My first real friend was in 6th grade. I wasn't permitted to be outside. I wasn't permitted to associate or socialize. It was all him, and that's really, with an abusive family, that's really common. They don't like outside light. So the things I had were Batman, Spider-Man, and these things that I would write, and it was crazy because I kind of suffered for my art. Like, the kids would see me writing and would mock it. Like that wasn't a masculine thing to do. And just look at me like I was weird or whatever. And the teachers would get a hold of this stuff and be like, like, we got a live one. Because my stuff was very dark and very pain-ridden, because that's where I was coming from. Like I was writing about the Holocaust and surviving abuse and just stuff that connected to things that I thought and things that I was feeling, and I never got affirmed for it. None of my friends ever affirmed, well, not friends, but none of the kids affirmed me for it. And none of the teachers ever took time to say, like, wow, you're communicating something. Like, how can I use this to connect to you? How can who are you? Like, help me understand you. Because it really was, like, the most honest reflection of who I was. I always disowned it. I'd always say, oh, it's just made up. I would never take ownership of it as a piece of myself. But, it was the truest truest communication I had. So that's how I coped for years. And then I went on this process of finding the drug. When I first found the drug, I felt like like when people talk about a conversion experience, I felt like I found the answer. My anxiety went away. My fear of other people went away. And I was able to talk to the girl I was scared to talk to. And I was able to get in a fight and not care if I won or lost. And talk to people and not care if I seemed stupid. It took away all that stuff. And it took away the thoughts that plagued me. Like, what's going to happen with my dad? What's going to happen with my mom? All that stuff went away. Like everybody else, it started destroying who I was. Like everything it gave me, it took away times 1,000. For about a year, I was gregarious and I was funny and I was the life of the party and everybody loved me and all that other stuff. And then I became violent. And then I became isolated. And then I became suicidal. And I remember laying on the train tracks, passing out. Not saying I'm going to kill myself, but just saying, well, see what happens. And I remember there was this window in my mom's apartment that was pretty high up, and I remember putting my hands on the sill, my feet on the back of the window sill, and my head was pointing right down at the ground. And I was drunk on rum, and I remember just thinking, like, all I got to do is move my hands, and I'll land flat on my face. And the last year of my use was not pleasurable, was not a party. It was the absence of thought. I wanted to be non-existent. I wanted to just disappear. And that was the last year, my friend Ricky died. He had a massive heart attack. He was 14 years old, natural causes. He was born with a birth defect. That was the first time I prayed as an adult, a teenager, was when I found out Ricky died. The week of his funeral, my father died. The following October, I was at a party where one friend shot and killed another friend. And that Christmas, my girlfriend, who was going to love me forever, said, I can't deal with you anymore, and just left. And I just went into this, I had nothing, everything I held on to, the art went away, they took, the writing died. Any other interest was gone. The only thing I had left was a drug. And at the end of that year, I woke up after a blackout and I thought, I had a good night. I finally had a good night. The last thing I remember was my friend flirting with a girl and I was laughing and it was like, we're young again. We got it back again. I was only 19, but I was looking for my glory days. And I woke up and then my mom was sobbing. She couldn't even speak. And I didn't know what I had done. And I thought I had beaten her. All the windows in the house were broken. I threw stuff all around and verbally abused her horribly. I didn't put my hands on her, but I harmed her to her core. And at that moment, I just wanted to kill myself. And I heard a voice say, give me a shot. Just give me a shot. I'd been going to church for a year, and I wouldn't get high before church, but I'd get high after. And I stopped stealing. But I couldn't give my life over. I was still living mainly in the drugs. I don't even know why I showed up at church for a year, but I did. And then that day, I decided to give my life over. And I went to a psych unit, and I refused medication, so they kicked me out. And I didn't know how to do anything else. So, I started praying, kept going to church, met a girl who I thought was pretty. She was going to NA meetings. I started going to NA meetings because I was following a pretty girl. And she relapsed and never came back. And I was going to church and I was going to meetings. And that's when the writing came back. And, a few of the things I wrote early on, I still recall the day when he first called me to pray. And all I could say was, don't let me hurt anymore. I'm impure and quite sure I'll make myself dead. You love me, or so your book said. If this is true, please bring me to you so I won't hurt this way. My Lord, I pray. In the blink of an eye, I got my reply in the form of a face, a word, an embrace, and grace that made my head and my heart suddenly still. God's will was to fill me with love undefined, plus a little piece of peace from my mind. All I wanted was a plot in the ground, a void devoid of all sight and sound. But now I see through the devil's lie, and I will wait for my Lord to reply. I think God put that in me my whole life, but it took on a new meaning. It was claimed in a different way. When I got sober, my whole life I wrote about pain, because it's all I knew, it's all I had. And then all of a sudden, there was a definite pain to what I was writing, but all of a sudden, there was hope, and there was something redeemed. And it helped me so much. And figuring out things differently, I started going to counseling. And my one counselor said to me something about my father that I'd never... It was the first time this guy, his name was Vince. He was a great therapist and an old Italian crazy guy. And one day he said to me, Rich, your dad, he was threatened by you. And I said, no, you're crazy. That's the first time I was like, whatever. My dad wasn't afraid of anybody.